So shooting anamorphic is a luxury most of us can't afford because it's, well, expensive. However, there's a very quick and easy way to do it in DaVinci Resolve that only takes a few minutes if you don't actually want the squeeze factor that anamorphic lenses give you. If you're after that background distortion, oval bokeh, or even lens flares, there's a few ways to kind of fake and get around this while still keeping it subtle and not too obvious that, well, it's an anamorphic. I believe it's incredibly important to start off with the gear you shoot with. This is the famed Helios 442 that has been modded to EF with a gear mount and a universal 82mm front ring adapter, specifically for the Sirui anamorphic adapter because I like the look it gives with this. However, if you're not using an anamorphic adapter, this lens is great because it's known for distorting the background, and not just typical distortion, but swirl distortion and barrel distortion, which is primarily known for being an anamorphic effect. This also has the added benefit of creating some interesting looking bokeh, which can be pushed a little in post-production to make it look oval. So when you shoot with a lens like this, it's a little easier to get that anamorphic look in post even before you start working with things. In Resolve, I have a clip that was shot on a Helios 442. Here's the original look, and here's with the color grade and added anamorphic effects. You'll notice that when I toggle between this, it doesn't look all that different, there just seems to be a little something extra. If you pay attention to the very left and very right corners, especially of these trees right here, you can definitely see the anamorphic look taking effect. Now, while I was using a Helios 442, I shot it on an APS-C camera, meaning that there was a 1.5 times crop in the image, meaning that most of the swirl that you normally get from that lens, you don't get here. So don't worry if you don't have a vintage lens like the Helios, this effect can still work super well. I'm gonna go ahead and disable the two effects I'm using for this look. You can very clearly see that difference take effect immediately. The two effects I'm using is radio blur and tilt shift blur. To access these effects, you can just search over in effects, radio blur or tilt shift blur, either one will pull up. I'm gonna go ahead and activate the radio blur and show you what settings I'm using. Now this shot was for a music video, so I tended to go a little bit stronger on the effect. Normally, I go to about 0.28, and I find that that looks nice. However, for here, 0.34 looks pretty good. Radio blur has two blur settings, stylized and realistic. I always go with stylized. Realistic just doesn't look anamorphic, and the edges of the frame don't seem to fall off like an anamorphic lens would. Stylized is definitely the way you want to go, since anamorphic is a stylized look. Now, the most important thing about radio blur, in my opinion, is the global blend. Turning this all the way up makes this very clear that it is a in-post effect and is fake. Pulling it down makes it a little harder to tell what's going on. I'd suggest adjusting this on a per clip basis, although about 0.75 I found is the sweet spot, especially if you're trying to go very stylized. If all you're trying to do is make a very, very subtle effect, going around 0.4 does a very good job of warping those edges, but not going overkill. Again, here's off and on. There's still a pretty good effect. However, 0.75 is where I like to be at. I think it looks quite nice. Now the second effect is tilt shift blur. I'm gonna go ahead and toggle this, and you probably didn't notice much. That's because it only affects the very top and the very bottom. Here's the depth map preview of what I'm doing. As you can see, I have it kind of going over his head because I really want to highlight the grain on the sides more than I do my subject in this shot for the music video. Now this has tons of different settings. However, one you're going to want to pay attention to under lens iris is anamorphism. If you go all the way to the bottom here, I'm going to take anamorphism all the way down and then back up again. You'll notice the blur is stretched side to side, which is exactly what anamorphic lenses do when something is out of focus. I suggest using this effect most of the time, not because of just that slider, but because it tends to pull the radio blur in a little tighter. You'll notice that at the bottom, if I take this off, you can kind of see the blur go on and off right here. The tilt shift blur stretches it side to side, where the radio blur kind of has this curved effect right here. What the tilt shift blur is doing is essentially making sure that at the top and bottom of the frame, the radio blur isn't obvious, and the radio blur is doing the same thing, making sure that at the top and bottom of the frame, that the tilt shift blur isn't obvious. These two effects in conjunction work really, really well, and I wouldn't suggest using one without using the other to some degree. Now, there are plenty of other effects you can use to glue these together, such as glow or light rays, I just found that neither of those effects were needed in this shot, and it pretty much ruined it if I used it. For example, there's the glow, and there's without the glow. I didn't like it, however, it does glue the sides together very, very well, and in certain shots, such as this one right here, I very much like to use glow and light rays. If I take these off, and then turn them back on, you can really see how much it glues together the radial blur and tilt shift blur. Now this shot right here is anamorphic, but just with an anamorphic adapter, and again the Helios 442, and it was shot on a red Dragon. I'd suggest using glow and light rays because it's very, very effective for making your image look very concise and glued together. Again, off and on. It will really glue together the radial and tilt shift blurs. Of course I wouldn't end this video without some cinematic shots showing off the radial and tilt shift blur.